Well, 60s. It was a time when society really pivoted.
There's 3,650 days in the 1960s, and the 70s come along just to end it. So what makes it the best decade? Well, it's how they spent it. Like how they became hippies and joined the Peace Corps and invented the birth control pill. Protested the Vietnam War and had the first televised presidential debate. Rioted at Stonewall, fought for civil rights, and started a second wave of feminism. Read The Feminine Mystique. Shot John F. Kennedy and MLK and put a man on the moon. It's a hoax. As you can see, there's a whole lot of stuff they did that made the 60s significant. So stick with me, cause I am gonna go through it all. No, you're not. So stick with me, cause I am gonna go through some of it. Come on, your dress isn't even from the 60s. It's impossible to talk about the 1960s without talking about the Civil Rights Movement, which was in full swing during the 60s, and was probably the main reason why the decade was so significant. See, when the 60s rolled around, segregation was still running rampant. Black people couldn't eat with white people, couldn't use the same restroom, couldn't even drink from the same water fountain. Segregation at bus stops was technically illegal, but that wasn't enforced. In February of 1960, at a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 black college freshmen challenged one of those rules simply by sitting down at the lunch counter and refusing to leave. This sparked many protests and many more young people participating in similar sit-ins. Martin Luther King Jr., a minister and civil rights activist, got involved and helped to start up the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The committee was made up of young people who planned on being a large group who would go into communities and get arrested in order to fill up the jails. People would ride buses into the South in order to force integration. The first bus of these Freedom Riders was fired on. People knew that continuing the rides would be dangerous, however they felt as though they had a moral obligation to fight. People getting off the buses were overtaken by mobs and beat with stones, chains, and baseball bats. On April 12, 1963, Martin Luther King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and 1,000 others marched towards downtown Birmingham in an attempt to get Birmingham to desegregate public facilities, which was a deliberate violation of an order placed by Police Commissioner Bull Connor not to demonstrate. King, Abernathy, and many others were jailed. Commissioner Bull Connor was strongly opposed to civil rights. He used police dogs on unarmed demonstrators and called in the fire department to hose people down. Americans saw this on TV and recognized the use of force against nonviolence. They saw how black people were being hurt by the law rather than protected. Martin Luther King Jr. enlisted an army of school children, ages 6 to 16, who joined on May 7th. After the first march, nearly 1,000 were put in jail. 1,000 more joined the march the next day and were doused with fire hoses, beaten with clubs, attacked by police dogs, and gassed. On May 10th, 1963, the leaders of Birmingham finally accepted the demands of the Freedom Marchers. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy tried to work out a civil rights bill. Civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington to support the bill. On August 28, 1963, over 2,000 people showed up. That was where Reverend Martin Luther King made his famous I Have a Dream speech. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson finished the work that Kennedy had started, bringing into existence the most important civil rights legislation signed into law since the 15th Amendment. The act prohibited discrimination for reason of color, race, religion, or national origin in public schools and employment. Also taking place in 1964, groups of students went down to Mississippi to try and register black voters and form freedom schools. 4 of the first went missing and were later found in a buried van shot in the head. Martin Luther King became the youngest person ever at the time to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He also had his first experience with violence by other African Americans against him when he was assaulted by black Muslims. In Selma, Alabama, 97% of 1,500 eligible black voters were unregistered due to intimidation/violence from authorities. African Americans could only attempt to register 2 days of the month and had to have a white person vouch for them. On March 7, 1965, 600 civil rights activists planned a march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. The police beat them up and trampled them with horses. This caused them to plan another, larger march, joined by Martin Luther King Jr. Lyndon B. Johnson made a speech in support of civil rights. On March 21st, 1965, 3,200 people began the march, protected by U.S. Army troops and Alabama National Guard forces. By the time the marchers got close to Montgomery, there were 25,000. On August 6, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests as a requirement for voting, mandated federal oversight of voter registration, where the tests had previously been used, and gave the U.S. Attorney General the duty of challenging the use of poll taxes for state and local elections. Despite all this, many black people felt Martin Luther King Jr. was too accommodating and that the change was too slow. They turned to Malcolm X, who believed in black nationalism and focused on using power and violence to get rights. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated, and in 1966, the Black Panther Party was founded. The party had a policy of shooting back when shot at, very different from previous nonviolent movements. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis by James Earl Ray. The civil rights movement of the 60s was a pivotal time for African Americans. They finally got the rights that had been wrongly withheld from them, and, while there was still a long way to go, it paved the way for racial equality.
Those who were fighting, when they returned, all I can remember is it was disgraceful.
Yeah.
It was not a celebration for their return. It was also like condemning them for being there.
Yeah, I remember.
And in the war. But yet the government sent them there.
America joined the Vietnam War in order to try and stop the spread of communism. While officially joining in March of 1965, America had been involved with the war even before that point, through coups, airstrikes, and bombings. In July of 1965, President Johnson sent 50,000 more ground troops to Vietnam and increased the draft to 35,000 men each month. In 1966, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam rose to 400,000, and in 1967, it rose to 500,000. Many Americans were dying, and television showed those at home the horrors of war. People realized that they weren't going to win the war anytime soon, and they didn't see the point in continuing to fight the war. Many college kids didn't want to go to war, so the less fortunate ended up having to when they refused. All over, people protested the war. Over 100 college campuses experienced violent protests. Even Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against the war. Although the war didn't end until 1975, the protests taking place in the 60s are still significant and should not be ignored.
When folks came back from the Vietnam War and we heard about some of the horrors of what happened over there, and also that it didn't make sense why we were fighting there, and for our people getting killed over something that just seemed to be way out of what was real at the time. You know, it was decided on such an upper echelon level that a lot of people that just saw people coming back from the war really didn't think it was necessary that we were there. And so that's what sparked a lot of protests.
Come and walk together, the American dream. Now the red, white, and blue is the red, gold, and green. The man controls the money and he starts a war. We're fighting now, that's what the working class is for. So he hides behind a Bible and he hides behind a flag. He hides behind your brother in a body bag. He hides beneath the covers, yeah, 'cause while he sleeps, he's counting up the bodies like he's counting sheep.
That was everybody stopped doing what they were doing and watched that because it was like unbelievable miracle. Nobody thought it would happen.
In 1961, Kennedy promised that the U.S. would put a man on the moon. The U.S. was in a space race against the Soviet Union, a product of the Cold War. The Soviets had already launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into space, put the first living being into orbit, a dog, put the first man into space, and their space probe had taken the first photos of the dark side of the moon. The Apollo missions were started with the purpose of putting a man on the moon and bringing him back after. On July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 was launched, containing astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon. They walked around, taking photographs and collecting samples for 3 hours. College stayed behind on the mothership to perform experiments and take pictures. They returned safely to Earth on July 24th, bringing back 35 kilograms of rocks. The moon rocks were found to be similar to basalt and were about 4,000 million years old. I shouldn't need to explain why this was important. They put a human being on the moon. Also, it helped further science and was a way of one-upping the Soviets. Yeah, okay. And they put a man on the moon.
My brother had a job, and he bought, that was our first TV, and we were sitting in the floor, and a bunch of neighborhood kids was watching it, and sitting in the floor watching. That was pretty historic. My grandfather, which lived out in New Mexico, he never believed they landed on the moon, because he always could sit there and say, there's places out here in the desert that look just like that. He never believed they landed on the moon.
On solid fuel and wires, turn the key and light the fires. We're leaving Earth today. This rocket's burning bright. We'll soon be out of sight and orbiting in space.
Well, everybody was on 12-hour shifts at the time. 12 hours on and I don't remember how much time we had off, but anyway, it was 12-hour shifts. And yes, it was very stressful. Everybody was working like crazy, not a lot of sleep.
On October 14th, 1962, American surveillance planes flying over Cuba discovered nuclear-tipped missiles targeted on the eastern part of the United States, introduced by the Soviet Union. President Kennedy put a naval blockade and a ring around Cuba to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies, and demanded removal of the missiles and destruction of the site. The blockade lasted for 13 days, and the U.S. military was put on DEFCON 2 for the first time in history. For 3 days, people waited with bated breath as the Soviets approached the quarantine line. Many Americans believed they were going to die. However, the Soviets turned back. The Soviet leader agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. In a secret deal, the U.S. agreed to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey. A teletype hotline was set up between the Moscow Kremlin and the White House to help avoid future crisis, and the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed on July 25, 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world's come to a full-on nuclear war, aka the end of the world.
Well, the stress took a long time to get over, because it doesn't just stop one day and then all of a sudden it's back to normal again. It's a long time to interpret what you've got, what they've done, what they have over there, what we have to force them to remove. So it went on for quite a while.
The one taking it back. Every day we're more and more. We are the ones who believe in the un-American way. Yeah, we are the ones that are gonna run the world someday.
While the counterculture movement of the 60s wasn't necessarily something that made it great, or even historically significant, it was a large part of what made up the 60s, and therefore should be gone over. The hippie movement took place mostly within the younger generation. They were a psychedelic group, what with the colors they wore and the drugs they used. Nobody cared who you were or where you came from, and you woke up each day not knowing what the day would bring. The hippies preached love, meaning nonviolence, tolerance, spontaneity, sharing, and peace. Their symbols were balloons, bubbles, flowers, and peace signs. They had their own newspapers, music, language, rock and roll, way of dressing, and police, Hells Angels. The purpose was to do your own thing, find your soul, figure out how to have fun, to not conform, to have individual freedom. They rejected the establishment, which made the established uneasy. They wanted to become turned on, which meant to find beauty and richness within. They became turned on through use of drugs like marijuana and LSD, which many people got arrested for.
We are the ones you thought you owned. We are the ones you said were stone. We are the ones that you wish would go away. We're here to stay. Yeah, we are the ones that are gonna run the world.
sitting in our little 6th grade class, and there was they had intercoms at that time where the principal would just announce stuff over the intercom. And the intercom turned on, and principal came on the intercom and announced, there's terrible news that just happened. Our president has just been assassinated, and we're going to have an impromptu assembly out in the playground area, the yard. And so we all went out, in very orderly fashion. I mean, all the kids were lined up with their teacher on the blacktop, and they had an impromptu kind of miniature service for the president at that time. And I remember while we were still in the classroom, my teacher started crying when that happened. She was really torn up, and so we were already kind of shaking from that. I'd say for the whole decade, the fact that somebody could get in and kill our president, because he was very popular at the time.
Some other important parts of the 60s. Kennedy was the youngest presidential candidate to date. His infectious enthusiasm and determination made people feel as though they could identify with him. He took part in the first presidential debates on TV, which helped show his charm and assisted his win, as well as changing the way elections were to be played out in America. His younger staff made people feel as though they could be involved in politics. And he started the Peace Corps as a way to counter the appeal of communism, which many people joined to try and do good for their country and the world. When he was shot in 1963, reality set in, and the feeling of invulnerability he gave people disappeared. The birth control pill was thought of by Margaret Sanger, founded by Catherine McCormick, and created by Gregory Pincus with help from John Rock. It was approved by the FDA on May 9, 1960, and gave women power over when and if they'd have children. The pill helped spur on a second wave of feminism, and in 1966, a group of feminists founded the National Organization for Women. The Stonewall Riots... Wait. Yeah? You already have a whole video about the Stonewall Riots on your channel. Oh yeah! Guess you guys should go check that out. Students at universities hadn't been able to give speeches without getting them cleared. When the students who were trying to register black voters and form freedom schools attempted to recruit more people at the University of California at Berkeley, they were barred. Thousands of students began protests that lasted 8 weeks. Student leaders were threatened with expulsion. At one point, students took over the campus. Regents of the university granted free speech to the students. The 1960s was also the time when Mary Poppins and 101 Dalmatians came out, which were pretty much the only 2 movies I watched as a kid, so...
It wasn't just politics that was exploding. It was art and poetry and just social consciousness in general.
You are the rich, the white, the old, selling your children's blood for gold. You lie to the world and you act like it's okay. No fucking way. Yeah, we are the ones that are gonna run the world someday. And you might laugh, and you might doubt it. There's nothing you can do about it, 'cause we are the ones that are gonna run the world someday.